Welcome to Yin and Young. The following is a story taken from Chapter 1. I have called it Hushed Conversations. I hope you enjoy it. On the other side of the planet, in a world far removed from anything Chinese, young Bobby sits with his knees folded under his stomach in the middle of the floor, gazing at his baby photo. On the right side of the photo stands a woman whose presence is only indicated from the waist up. Her face is not in the picture. It is Bobby's grandmother. She is a stout woman in an apron-covered dress that Bobby remembers as blue with little white flowers. Bobby is sitting in a round white Tupperware tub, normally used for mixing flour, but now it serves as his bath. Bobby is at the age where it is difficult to completely balance his head on the top of his body. You can hear his chubby legs swish back and forth in the water, and observe as his toes open and close, coos of excitement. His hands are firmly gripping the sides of the tub, and his eyes are wide in pure sensation and pleasure. He has the appearance of a rider sitting in the first basket of a roller coaster as it surmounts that most exhilarating drop into eternity. The tub is on the kitchen table. It is not hard to imagine the odors of toast and coffee, and the buttery onion scent of pierogies being prepared for dinner. The grandmother's supportive hands no longer remain in this world. They are only captured here in this old photo album, its plastic coil spine curling through thick pages, covered in clear but now yellowing plastic film, stiffened over time. Each page, front and back, has thin strips of gluing that hold the photos in place, and the vellum seals it like insects in amber. Photos of a time and place that do not exist anymore, but from which everything is connected. It was once an empty book on a general store shelf, but life keeps pressing into it like wild grass, spreading in a newly tilled plot of land. At the time just prior to Bobby's birth, his father Ben was living and working over 700 miles west, close to his mother and father in Dawson Creek, a small city on the eastern border of central British Columbia. Should he decide to visit his pregnant wife Hannah, he would need to drive east into Alberta about 6 hours before arriving in Edmonton. There he could get some lunch at a gas-stop cafe somewhere, fuel up, and travel another 6 hours directing his car further east to Weldon, a small hamlet about 1 hour south of the South Saskatchewan River. If he traveled in winter, he would leave in the darkness of the morning, and would arrive in the darkness of the evening with a warm meal awaiting him. As he was a very young man, and since there was a baby coming, Ben needed to work to develop the Smitty's restaurant he recently purchased, while Hannah stayed with her family in Weldon. Hannah was not feeling well that first Saturday of the new year. The height of her adolescent changes, combined with the swollen sausage feeling of pregnancy, made her body feel like an intrusive foreign object. It was impossible to find a position that made her comfortable. The sun set in the late afternoon, and cold began to creep into dark corners of the house. Hannah's mother used the extender handle to hook an iron lid off the coal stove surface, inspecting the flames within. Satisfied, she tossed a tissue into the fire, then replaced the lid into the fitting. She slid a pot heaped with snow into place for boiling potatoes. The snow soon began to melt while steam rose, producing cool humidity as it spread to the windows, crystallizing into glittery smears of reflected light. The temperature outside was 14 Fahrenheit and dropping. Perhaps it would reach 0 tonight, which would not be bad for January. It could be much colder. Hannah pulled the blanket up around her neck as she tried to make herself comfortable on the couch. The smell of cabbage, onions, and sausages frying, the sound of her mother's feet sliding on the floor, and the creaking floorboards gave her a sense of safety, while doing nothing to end the physical discomfort. It had been colder on her birthday last November, Hannah thought to herself, and there were no presents for her that day as usual, since her father didn't allow such selfish holidays. He had his reasons and was happy to explain to her, but no matter what he said, it always felt unfair. All her friends got presents on their birthdays, and so did her cousins, and they were Christians, so she couldn't be convinced that God opposed the birthday presents. Every time her birthday came around, Hannah hoped that this year would be different. Perhaps this day, because of the challenges of the year, because she was carrying a child in her womb, or because she had been deprived of the grade 8 schooling and social engagement she might have had, perhaps this time her father would surprise her with a thoughtful gift. The day began mildly promising. Her father was at home that morning, and her mother was preparing a lunch of buns with various cold meats, cheese, and mayonnaise for 1 o'clock. Canned pickles from garden cucumbers and beets were set in dishes, and a crocheted tablecloth had been spread. Her father was in his office putting leaflets into envelopes. Her 2 aunts, Julia and Pauline, would soon arrive, and with their arrival lend a little festivity to the day. Around 12:50, just minutes before the aunts were to arrive, the phone rang. Hannah jumped to answer it. "Hello?" "Hello, is that Hannah?" The voice on the other end had the slightly strained rasp that often accompanies the voice of someone who makes his living by talking. It was her older brother Danny calling from Toronto. In those days, long-distance phone calls sounded far away, as if through a long tube. "Yes," replied Hannah loudly. She loved her brother and was always happy to hear his voice, but her loud excitement indicated to those around that she was in a long-distance call. "It's your birthday, isn't it?" he offered. "Yes, my 15th, she said, too nervous to know what else to say. "I will always remember your birthday," he said with a warm smile in his voice. He tried to be sensitive about the pregnancy and only said, "How are you feeling these days?" "Okay," she replied. Actually, she didn't really want to talk about the baby, but at least when he asked, she didn't feel embarrassed. Rather, she had the slight hope that his goodwill alone might remove her from her circumstances. But then followed a tone of somber care. "Listen, Hannah, I'm sorry to end the call so early, but I need to talk to Dad. Can you put him on the line?" "Uh-huh," she said. Though she was disappointed by such an abrupt end to the conversation, she was also worried. Her father had already heard the call and soon took over the phone. "Is that Danny?" he asked, while taking the phone from Hannah. Her father Alexander's voice was always loud, but on the phone it was booming. "Hello! Is that Danny? Danny! How are you? Where are you calling from?" While he settled in the chair beside the phone with his manly sense of importance, there was a knock on the door, and after the slightest pause, Auntie Julia came in with Auntie Pauline. The entrance was just the other side of a small dividing wall, where Alexander was on the phone. The 2 aunts entered the house, completely engaged in an animated conversation about a problem Julia was having with the neighbor's dog, who always came to her yard, leaving yellow stains and brown packages in the snow in front of her house. She was so disgusted with it. They entered while Alexander was already speaking loudly on the phone, and they automatically raised their voices in order to hear each other, causing Alexander's tone to rise as well. It was an instant hubbub. Alex peered around the corner, eagerly indicating that he was on a long-distance call. The two of them nodded, then smiled to Hannah, who stood watching them. Both of them had such pale skin and such white hair that they brought an angelic presence with them. "Hello, darling," Auntie Julia said to her. Julia's eyes were small, but her face shone with brilliance. She leaned down and planted a wet kiss on Hannah's cheek. Auntie Pauline was more conserved. She smiled, but also sighed with downturned eyebrows as she looked for a place to drop her large black purse. Meanwhile, Alexander's voice on the phone had come to a stop. He sat by the phone, his head hanging, each hand propped on either leg. He had a look of a sagging tent. "What is wrong?" Julia asked, as Pauline sat on the couch, her spectacles reflecting the room. "I just spoke with Danny," he said. "President Kennedy has been assassinated." "Oh," Julia said. "Dear." She dropped into one of the kitchen chairs, her care turning quickly to worry, her eyes turning to tiny pools of liquid. Hannah's father went to the living room, turned on the radio a bit louder than usual. He sat down, but soon rose again to pace the living room and stare out the living room window, only to sigh, pace around again, and sit. This restless behavior persisted until finally he once again sat, his eyes disappearing either to stare at the floor or gaze out the window. Frequently he wiped his eyes. From that point, the day progressed by degrees into a gloom of tears, hushed conversations, and continuous reference to the drama playing out on the radio. Neighbors came by. They cried. They prayed. It seemed the world was suddenly threatened with a great evil, and Hannah, whose birthday was never really celebrated, added this mood of death to mark her special day. Hannah retreated to her room and sat on the edge of her bed, gazing absent-mindedly at her mystery books. She had read them already, and found no solution there for the lump in her throat. She picked up her white church Bible with the little cross dangling on the zipper. It felt dry like a bland crust of bread in her hands. She pulled on the zipper and, flipping the pages, let it rest open on Romans. Her eyes landed on chapter 12, verse 12. "Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer." She read the verse, but it didn't register. It seemed to her like her father's talking. She set the Bible down on her bed and placed her hand on her raised belly, now only a month or so from birth. "I'm going to make sure you have birthdays, and Christmas, and all the holidays," she whispered. At some point, Auntie Julia gently knocked on the door and came inside. She sat down on the bed beside Hannah, handing her a piece of homemade Saskatoon pie. It was November, but this pie was made with berries picked last summer down by the river. The crust of the pie was light and fluffy, and made with skilled hands, hands already spotted with age. Julia patted Hannah's leg, and bent her face around to look into Hannah's eyes directly. It was obvious from the redness around her eyes that Auntie Julia had been crying. Julia was a very sensitive aunt. She could not help being distressed by the death of Kennedy, but she did not forget Hannah either. She patted Hannah's leg, snuck a smile, and with bright gray eyes wished her happy birthday. "It must be very difficult and confusing to you right now, dear. It is your birthday, and you are going to soon have your own baby." You are young, and there is so much hope for a good life, but everyone around you is crying their eyes out and being so serious. Try to enjoy this pie, sweetheart. I warmed it on the stove, and there is ice cream here. God loves you, dear, and so do I. All your family loves you, your aunts, your mother and father, and your brother and sister, and cousins. It is a world of love, but you are only seeing the smallest tip of it right now. Try not to worry, dear. Everything will be all right, okay? Eat this pie. I made it for you. She stayed a while, smiling and sitting beside Hannah while she ate her pie. Compared to the white Bible, this pie was the only thing to give Hannah courage. It was so delicious, and the taste of it was love. To her it was a lit window on a dark night. The memories of pie on her birthday comforted Hannah as she came back in her mind to this Saturday in January, and the awareness that she would soon be experiencing a new kind of birthday. In a matter of days, or perhaps even hours, she thought, as she stared into the darkness outside, she would be the mother of her own child. Her father was preparing for a trip and had just returned into the house after running a few errands. Hearing him stamp the snow off his feet and the rubber sound of galoshes squeaking, Hannah pulled a letter out from under the blanket and read it for the third time, or perhaps the fourth now. It was a letter from her niece who lived in Fort St. John, about an hour northwest of Dawson Creek. Her mother Lena was Hannah's sister. Lena was 18 years old when Hannah was born, and had already started a substantial family of her own. Any time their dusty old Buick pulled up for a visit, a flow of energy in the shape of many children's bodies would burst out the doors. Hannah had several nieces and nephews by her sister, and all of them were near to her in age, most older and a few younger. The letter she was now reading was written by Tiffany, the niece nearest to her in age, and every bit as much a friend as she was family. Sitting on the couch, Hannah read the letter describing how Tiffany's family had spent their Christmas. She spoke of how busy the church was and of the tiresomeness of all the meetings. She spoke of having to help her mother with cooking and the annoying boy whose family was invited to share the Christmas Eve meal. She listed some of the presents that were given and received, and she closed the letter with wishes for the love of Jesus in all that is to come. Nothing was mentioned about the baby's anticipated arrival, but Hannah could tell she was getting support. This was important to Hannah, as her sister Lena took several opportunities to get Hannah by herself and tell her what a burden this child would be to the family, and that it was far better to give it up for adoption. The child would have a much greater hope for a good life, and Hannah would be able to finish her schooling. These conversations were always awkward and made Hannah feel some unnameable distress. Dinner was served. Hannah came to the table and listened to her father talk about some gossip he had picked up at Harvey's, the only general store in town. The Harveys knew everyone who came and went, and always welcomed people with a juicy bit of do-tell. Alexander, like many of the town folk, liked to come into the shop just to pour himself a cup of coffee and enjoy the banter and intrigue one expected upon entering the door. "Hey there, Mr. Hicks," Mrs. Harvey would say. "How's the carpentry business treating you? Are you still enjoying Mrs. Hicks' crabapple jam?" Such inquiries would soon enough lead to a phrase that began, "Have you heard about?" or, "Tragic what's been going on with." This afternoon the topic was, "So sad what's been happening at the Thompson house, did you hear?" The Thompsons were the young Aboriginal family who lived in the northwest corner of town along the highway heading north. Someone said that Wendy had been chasing her husband around outside the house the previous evening with a butcher knife. There had been a big scene with lots of shouting while the neighbors hid in their homes, peeking through curtains and pacing up and down darkened halls. Hannah's father chewed on this gossip with her mother, and the general conclusion was drawn that the family seemed quite unhappy, and that they really should do something about all that drinking. The food was eaten, the dishes were cleared, the last coffee was poured. Within 30 minutes the lamps were shut, as gradually the inner darkness of the home began to correspond to the darkness outside. The walls and floorboards began to creak and bump as the cold slowly penetrated into the house. In this part of town there were yet no streetlights, and all that could be seen was the moonlit glow of the snow-covered field across the way, casting long midnight shadows. It was growing very quiet, and Hannah's discomfort did not ease. In fact, it got worse, until many hours later, in a 6-bedroom hospital on the other side of the farmer's field, a child was born. They named him Bobby. It was fitting, perhaps, that Hannah was taken to the hospital under the cover of night. Hannah, having a child at such a young age, invited concern from all her neighbors, and her name was no doubt spoken over cups of coffee at Harvey's. "It's such a pity what Hannah got herself into. Imagine what her family must be going through," they would worry. "Now she has all this responsibility. Just think what's ahead for the poor child." "Which child?" someone joked. A bit of subdued laughter would be followed by a more philosophical attitude about how society is changing and whatnot. On such talk went. And though Hannah was confined to her family's home, which was not well insulated against the cold whisper of winter, it was nevertheless thought to be appropriate that Hannah keep a low profile. She should not go prancing about town in her condition. She should display an appropriate amount of shame and responsibility for the new child. In the small and uncomfortable space of her parents' home, Hannah lived with her mother, who barely spoke, and with a father who was deeply religious, devoting himself to causes that deprived him of a path to any kind of material prosperity for him and his family. Often he would leave home and go on weeks-long religious ventures of one sort or another. And into this world, devoid of anything to charm a young girl, a child was born, a child who represented the failure of living up to her family's values, as well as the surrounding community. Yet this same child inspired a devotion in Hannah that was lacking until now. And as she worked her way through the winter months, some days as immature teenager, and other days as rapidly maturing mother, and as the snows melted into spring and the town set about planting new crops, Hannah's love for this child grew, and so did her world. Yes, some people long for a life that is simple and planned. As Yinlin and Bobby began their lives, they were already passengers on an adventure that hardly seemed simple. Yet everyone had a hope that this would change. As both Canada and China grew in the world of nations, life stabilized and had a hopeful tendency toward predictability and security. Tied with a ribbon. China believed itself headed toward its communist utopia, and Canada believed itself to be a shining example of the modern world, gentle friends of the great neighbor next door. Some people won't sail the sea 'cause they're safer on land. Yinlin in her glittery bath, and Bobby holding the rails of his tub in wide-eyed enthusiasm. At this point of their lives they could only see what was immediately before them. follow what's written. That is the life of children. But I'd follow you to the great unknown.